A new school. Mrs. Timor, I need to find a school that can meet the needs of my children. It has been a difficult search, due to their unique needs. I had hoped to find a school before we moved, but the ones I looked at did not have appropriate programs. We have been in the area now for 2 weeks and I need to get my kids in school. Some friends of mine have told me about your school and suggested I look into it. Here at Learning Time Private School we feel that every child can learn and has the right to be pushed to their greatest potential. We serve grades preschool through 8th grade. Our school also includes a variety of additional services to meet the struggling or gifted student. Tell me a little about your children and we will see if Learning Time is a good match. Well, I have 2 children, Joanne who is 8 and in 3rd grade, and Andy just turned 11. None of the schools I have looked at have had programs that could meet Andy's needs. He is not toilet trained, speaks only in 2 to 3 word phrases, and acts like an early 2-year-old. He isn't a behavior problem or anything. He is a well-behaved little boy, always cheerful, but none of the private schools around appear to have programs to meet his needs. I understand your struggle, Mrs. Musi. Here at Learning Time we do have special classes for kids with special needs, but most private schools in the area do not serve children that low. Our founders felt it was important to provide all children access to quality education. The classroom we have for Andy currently has 5 children in it with 2 adults. The teacher, Mrs. Jones, has 20 years as a special education teacher. That is great to hear, Mrs. Timor, Mrs. Musi said as she started to relax. Finding a place for Andy has given me many sleepless nights. Having an 11-year-old toddler is not easy at times. Joanne's challenges are different, but just as difficult to deal with and find a placement for. Although she is able to function in a regular 3rd grade classroom, she goes through periods when she struggles with her toileting skills. Most of the time, she is able to function in regular underwear with few accidents. When she is struggling with her toileting skills, I will put her back into pull UPS or diapers depending on the severity of the issues at the time. Most private schools I have looked at refuse to take a 3rd grader unless they have no toileting issues. Like I said, Mrs. Musi, here at Learning Time we do not hold weaknesses against children and view our job as moving a child from their current skill level to the next. If this involves toilet training, then that is just as important to their education as reading and math are. We do not currently have any 3rd graders in the regular 3rd grade classroom with toileting issues as severe as your daughter's, but we can accommodate. There is a changing table in Mrs. Jones' classroom for when she is in diapers and not using the toilet at all. No, she doesn't need to be in Mrs. Jones' class with Andy. She functions at a regular 8-year-old level except for occasional difficulty with toileting, Mrs. Musi pleaded. I understand, Mrs. Musi. I am not saying that Joanne should be in Mrs. Jones' classroom. To address her toileting needs, however, we have 2 places in the building for a child to get changed when they have toileting issues. The office's health room is used when a child is able to do most or all of the job of cleaning and changing by themselves. If a child needs an adult to change them or clean them up, like when they are wearing diapers instead of pull UPS, the changing table in Mrs. Jones' room is used. That is where we have the staff and facilities to better meet that level of need. She would only need to go to Mrs. Jones' classroom to get her diapers changed, not to be taught there. If she is able to handle the demands of the regular 3rd grade classrooms, then that is where she will be placed, Mrs. Timor tried to reassure Mrs. Musi. If she doesn't need to be laid down to be cleaned up, and is able to clean most or all of herself up, like when she is in pull-ups, she can get changed in the health room. That night Mrs. Musi told her husband all about Learning Time Private School. So, they really don't have a problem with Andy being an 11-year-old toddler. Mr. Musi asked his wife for the 3rd time. Joanne stopped in the hall staring at her mom walking down the hallway. What she was saying didn't make sense. How can she have to keep her pull UPS dry for 2 weeks before wearing panties, but still have a choice to not wear pull-ups to school on the first day? She had wet her pants 3 days ago while picking up some stuff at the store for their new house. Joanne, Mrs. Musi said, looking at her as she turned into Andy's room. Once I get Andy's diaper changed and have him dressed for his first day of school, I will be in to help you get ready. Joanne stood in the hall just staring down at Andy's doorway. Mom had gone inside to get Andy ready, but she was still puzzled by Mom's comments. They didn't make any sense. She couldn't wear panties till she had been in dry pull-ups for 2 weeks, but she didn't have to wear pull UPS to school. If she can't wear panties, and she doesn't have to wear pull-ups, then she would be wearing. No! Joanne yelled. Joanne stomped up to Andy's door. Mom, I am not going to school in diapers. Joanne, it is your choice. If you don't want to wear pull UPS, you can wear diapers instead. The school is okay with you wearing either one, but since you had an accident 3 days ago, you have to wear one of them. Mrs. Musi finished diapering Andy and started to dress him for the day. But Mom. Mrs. Musi didn't respond. She finished dressing Andy and then turned to Joanne, who was still standing in the doorway. Okay, your turn, Joanne. Come on over here and I will put a nice clean and dry diaper on you for your first day at your new school. Mom. Well, Joanne, you said you didn't want to wear pull UPS on your first day, so that just leaves diapers. So let's get your diaper on and then get you dressed for the day, Mrs. Musi said, patting the top of the changing table. No, Mom. I don't want to wear Andy's diapers to school. Okay, let's go down to your room and get some of yours. I really don't care whose diapers you are wearing. But since you decided you were not going to wear pull UPS to school, diapers are the only other choice. I'll wear pull UPS. Honest, Mom, I will. Just don't make me wear diapers to school. I am not a baby like Andy is. Be nice, Joanne, Andy is your older brother. Now come with me down to your room and let's get you dressed. Joanne looked at Andy, her 11-year-old brother. He was dressed like a preschooler, which included a preschool character on his bib overalls. He was sitting on the floor playing with a ring stacker. Shaking her head, she headed for her room. On her way, she wasn't sure if Mom would let her wear pull UPS or not. Had she pushed Mom too far? Would Mom let her be a big 8-year-old, or would she decide that a kid needing to wear pull UPS or diapers to school needs to dress like a little kid? Walking in just behind Mom, Joanne tried to push Mom towards letting her wear pull-ups, by going straight over to her supply and picking out a pull-up for her to be changed into. Oh, I thought you didn't want to wear those, but if you changed your mind, that is okay. Let's get you out of your wet nighttime diaper and into this dry pull-up. Very quickly Mom had Joanne's wet diaper off and had her into the pull UPS. Joanne didn't like that she used a lot of baby powder in the process, feeling that it made her smell like a baby, but she didn't say anything to Mom. Okay, Joanne, this will not be your first day in your classroom, but it will be the first day for you and the people at the school to meet. The headmaster said you needed to take a test today, so they can figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are. I want you to be a good little girl and try your best on the test, Mrs. Musi said as she went through Joanne's closet looking for the perfect outfit for her little girl to wear to school. Mrs. Musi picked out a frilly pink dress. Upon seeing it, Joanne closed her eyes and sighed. Pull UPS, baby powder, and being dressed like a 5-year-old was not Joanne's idea of an ideal start to a new school. To make matters worse, Mom put her hair into pigtails coming off the top of her head, just adding to the little girl look. Joanne wanted to be a big girl, but as she headed down to breakfast, she didn't feel like one. I only have to wear pull UPS for 2 weeks, right, Mommy? Joanne asked as she followed her mom into Andy's room. Getting Andy away from his toys and heading down to the kitchen, she replied, 2 weeks if you can get all your pee-pee and poopy in the potty. If not, it will be longer. I won't have any accidents at school, Mommy. I promise. Joanne poopy, Andy said. I am not going to poop my pants at school, Andy. You do that, not me. No way are the other kids going to find out about my pool UPS and diapers. If I poop my pants at school they will find out, so I am not going to poop at school. Joanne dear P, Andy said. Andy dear P. That is right Andy, Mrs. Musi said as she put a bib on Andy. If Joanne can't keep her pool UPS dry and clean she will be wearing diapers to school just like you do. What? You would make me wear diapers to school like Andy? No Mommy. In diapers you say I have to use the diapers, not the potty. Don't make me go poopy in the middle of my 3rd grade class, please Mommy. I will be a good girl and use the potty. I promise Mommy. I promise. Joanne, it is not up to me. You will decide if you wear pool UPS, diapers, or panties to school. If you can always use the potty at school, then the school will let you wear panties. If you can't, then they will put you in diapers. You decide, not me. Mrs. Musi poured milk into the kids' cereal. Chapter 3. Starting new. Joanne walked into the school's office first, followed by Mrs. Musi holding Andy's hand. As Joanne walked up to the secretary's desk, she kept looking around the office. My oh my, you certainly are a lovely little girl. You look and smell like a sweet little angel, the secretary commented. Looking up at Mrs. Musi she asked, is this little cherub joining our kindergarten class this year? Joanne looked up at her mom with horror. She knew she looked like a baby, and the secretary just confirmed it. They thought she was a kindergartner, not a big 3rd grader. No, Joanne here would like to be in your 3rd grade class this year, but I guess if she doesn't do a good job on the entrance exams today she might be placed into kindergarten. I wouldn't mind if my baby was still in kindergarten. I definitely wasn't ready for my baby to be a big 3rd grader. Oh, I am so sorry, Joanne, the secretary said. How old is our big girl here? I am 8 years old, Joanne said with pride. Well, big 8-year-old Joanne, we certainly don't have any 8-year-olds in kindergarten. Here at Learning Time, we make sure kids are placed in a grade according to their skills, not their age, but the testing will tell us what grade you will be placed in, the secretary said with a smile. And this is Andy, Mrs. Musi said, ruffling Andy's hair. Me Andy. The secretary giggled, hi there Andy, and how old are you? Me you even, Andy replied, hugging onto Mommy. Me big boy. Yes you are Andy. It is so nice to meet you. Mrs. Timur said he will be in Mrs. Jones' class. She said he could visit the class today while Joanne was taking her tests, Mrs. Musi said to the secretary. Yes, they were expecting him. I will call Mrs. Jones and let her know Andy is here, the secretary said as she picked up the phone. Mrs. Musi got the registration papers out of her purse and put them on the secretary's desk. While waiting for Mrs. Jones, the kids were directed over to some chairs. Mommy, Joanne quietly asked. What is it, princess? Will they really send me to kindergarten if I don't do well on the tests? No, Joanne, but they may put you back into 2nd grade. That is why it is important that you try your best on the tests today. Show them that you belong in 3rd grade and they will put you in 3rd grade. Even if I am wearing pool UPS, Joanne quietly inquires. 3rd graders don't wear pool UPS, do they? Smiling down at Joanne, Mrs. Musi reassured her, yes my little princess. If you can do 3rd grade level work they will put you in 3rd grade, even if you are in pool UPS or diapers. Mom. Joanne quietly expressed her disapproval of Mom's comment about diapers. Mrs. Jones interrupted the interaction as she came into the office. She introduced herself and then focused in on Andy. "Me Andy," he said, jumping up from his chair. "You teacher?" "Yes I am, Mrs." Jones said with a smile. "I am your teacher, Mrs. Jones." "Can you say Mrs. Jones?" "Mrs. Jones." "You teacher?" "You teacher." "You Andy teacher?" "Yes Andy." "Do you want to go down and see the classroom?" "Me go." "Me go." "Mommy," Andy inquired while jumping up and down. "Me go." "Yes Andy, you can go with Mrs. Jones down to your new class. Be a good boy for Mrs. Jones." "Me good." "Me big boy." Joanne shook her head back and forth and rolled her eyes. Mrs. Musi handed the diaper bag over to Mrs. Jones and waved bye as they walked away. As soon as they were back sitting down, Mrs. Timor came out of her office and called Mrs. Musi over. "Morning, is Joanne ready for the testing?" "Yes, but Joanne is nervous. She is also worried that you will put her in kindergarten, especially since she is wearing pull UPS. I am not going to put an 8-year-old in the kindergarten classroom." "I know, but with her wearing pull UPS, she feels more like a kindergartner at the moment than a third grader." "Look at her though, Mrs. Musi said, looking lovingly at her baby girl. "She was so upset this morning about people at school finding out she is wearing pull UPS, but now she is playing with the hem of her dress, showing her pull UPS off to everyone. I am always telling her to put her dress down, and 5 minutes later it is up again. Little ones in diapers and pull UPS don't seem to be as careful to hide their undergarments as kids in underwear are, Mrs. Timor said understandingly. "Why don't we get her started on the tests?" Next to the headmaster's office was another small room with a conference table and a computer in the corner. Mrs. Timor logged Joanne into the test and got her started. The grown-ups left her alone to take the test and went back to the headmaster's office. "Mrs. Musi, it is going to take Joanne an hour or two to finish the testing. Have you had a chance to finish the registration paperwork?" "Yes, I gave them to the secretary, Mrs. Musi paused in contemplation. "Could we go down and look in on Andy? I am a little worried about whether or not he will fit in. We usually don't like the parents observing in a room within the first few hours a child starts, but considering it isn't exactly a regular classroom, let's go and peek in." Mrs. Timor led the way. As they approached the classroom, Mrs. Timor set down the rules. "Now, we will look in on Andy. If we can do that from the window next to the door, then that is where we will stay. If we can't see him from there, we will go just inside the classroom. Try not to interact with Andy. Andy and the staff are working on developing a bond and learning their roles. The staff is also trying to figure out his strengths and weaknesses." From the classroom window they could see Andy sitting at the table in the room happily playing with a CNC. Andy would pull the lever, listen to the toy and then say the name or sound of the animal. He would clap with glee before pulling the lever again. Mrs. Musi also looked around at the other kids in the room. One of the kids was working on a task involving crayons and paper with Mrs. Jones, while the other children were playing with various toddler and preschooler toys. The assistant in the room suddenly stood up and looked around the room. She walked around the room, stopping momentarily at each child and ending at Andy. Saying something to Mrs. Jones, she took Andy into the back room. "That is the bathroom, Mrs. Timor said. "Looks like Andy needs a poopy diaper changed." Mrs. Jones' assistant, Teacher Mary, is very good with the kids. "Timing is about right, Mrs. Musi replied. "It has been about an hour since breakfast. He usually needs to be changed 45 minutes to an hour and a half after he eats." Back in Mrs. Timur's office, she started talking about the plans for Joanne. The academic tests will determine if she is put in second or third grade. At 8 years old, she would fit into either grade level. I have picked a teacher for each grade level and have already talked to them about Joanne. Both said they would like her to start today after the testing, if that is okay with you. I don't really have a problem with her starting today, Mrs. Musi hesitantly said. However, I didn't bring any supplies for her to start school today. Since some of their school supplies are still packed away, we were going to go shopping after the testing, once we had the supply list. The teachers know she probably will not have any supplies, but they still welcome her to stay, Mrs. Timur said. The other concern I have is how she might react if you put her back into second grade. She started this school year in a third grade classroom. She tries really hard to view herself as a big girl, especially considering her older brother. With her having to wear full UPS to school and being put back into second grade, she might need a little bit of time to adjust. It is a lot for a little kid to deal with. The offer is there if you want it. Even if she ends up back in second grade, I would still recommend it. Immediately facing an issue is often better than letting the fear of the unknown build inside. The two of them continued to chat for a while until they were interrupted by a kid who was sent to the office for teasing. Mrs. Musi went out and sat in the school office while the headmaster dealt with the child. It took Joanne just over an hour to finish the reading and math tests. How do you think you did, Princess, Mrs. Musi asked as Joanne was hugging her. It started out easy, Mommy, but then got hard. I didn't know how to do all the problems it gave me. Does that mean I can't go to third grade, Mommy? We are going to have to wait and see, Joanne. The test wasn't designed just for third graders. They give the same test to all the kids kindergarten through 5th grade. We knew there would be some hard questions, that is part of the test. Don't worry about it, Joanne. We just have to sit and wait for the results. Chapter 4. Andy's room. Joanne sat down in the chair next to Mommy and they waited. It didn't take long for Mrs. Timur to come out and call Mrs. Musi over to her office. Joanne stayed in her chair. Well, the results say her reading skills are at an early third grade level and her math skills are at a mid-second grade level. I would like to start her in third grade with these results. Based upon these scores, she should do well in Mrs. Renton's class. Can we start her today? I guess that would be okay. Joanne will just be thrilled she gets to go to third grade. She is so worried you won't let her be a third grader. Heading back out into the school office, Mrs. Musi saw Joanne again playing with the lace at the bottom of her dress hem. Joanne's pull UPS were on full display, and the closer Mrs. Musi got, the clearer it became that Joanne was wet and needed to be changed. Before reaching Joanne, Mrs. Musi turned to the headmaster and said, "Looks like Joanne is wet and needs to be changed. I wasn't expecting to be here more than 2 hours, and didn't bring any pull UPS for her to change into. So, I guess her first day is going to have to be tomorrow. What do you normally do if you are away from home and she has an accident, when you didn't pack pull UPS, Mrs. Timur asked with a hint of assumed knowledge. Well, we always have Andy's diaper bag and I just put her in diapers for the rest of the day. Are there enough diapers in Andy's bag to get the two of them through the rest of the school day? There should be, Mrs. Musi confirmed. I always keep his diaper bag well packed. Well then, Mrs. Musi, I recommend you tell Joanne she will be starting third grade today and let us deal with getting her changed. Joanne needs to learn how things will happen here at school, and this will give us a chance to teach her from the very start. Mrs. Musi looked at the headmaster questioningly. Are you sure about that? Joanne is not going to be happy about having to wear diapers to her first day of school here. She made that very clear this morning when it came up as a possibility. You also need to know, Joanne makes no attempt to use the toilet while in a diaper. It is almost like her brain magically stops all her training once a diaper is put on her. She won't even tell you when her diaper needs to be changed. Because of this, I have never sent her to school in a diaper before, even though I have threatened to on many occasions. We can handle it, Mrs. Musey. If both diapers and pull UPS are a part of Joanne's life at home, they will be part of her life here at school. School and home need to work together when toilet training a child, with all steps done at home also implemented at school. You said there are times when Joanne gets frustrated with her lack of progress and just gives up putting in any effort. During these times, you correctly put her back into diapers. Here at school we will do the same thing. The school staff needs to get used to addressing her issues and figuring out Joanne when it comes to these situations. We might as well start today. If you are sure, said Mrs. Musey. Going up to Joanne, she congratulated her for doing her best on the testing. She told Joanne that the school wanted her to start in 3rd grade today. Even with getting those questions wrong, I can still go to 3rd grade. Yes, princess. Your new teacher, Mrs. Renton, wants to meet you and have you start in her classroom this morning. I will come back at the end of the school day to pick you and Andy up. Can you be a good girl for Mommy today? Yes, Mommy. I'll be a good girl. I promise. Joanne, I want you to do what the teachers tell you to do, with no arguing. Be a big 3rd grader for Mommy. Okay. With a final hug, and the secretary giving Mrs. Musey the 3rd grade supply list, they said goodbye. Joanne stood in the office next to Mrs. Timor, watching Mommy leave. Well, Joanne, we need to get you down to Mrs. Renton's 3rd grade classroom. Joanne's big blue eyes looked up at Mrs. Timor and in a mild little voice she asked, "Is she nice?" "Oh yes, Joanne. Mrs. Renton is very nice and does a lot of fun things with her students. When she heard you were coming, Mrs. Renton planned a special class art project. She has been waiting for you to start school before doing it." Joanne smiled up at Mrs. Timor. "Before we go down to class, however, we need to go into the health room. Mrs. Allen, can you join us please?" "Sure, Mrs. Allen said, getting up from her secretary's desk. Confused, Joanne went into the health room with the 2 adults. In the health room, Mrs. Timor knelt down to Joanne's level. "Now Joanne, here at school we need to make sure kids are not going around school with wet or messy pants. So if you are wearing pull UPS or diapers, we need to check you several times throughout the day to make sure they are dry and clean. If they are not, we will need to get you into dry and clean pants. If you are wearing pull UPS, you will come here to the health room and Mrs. Allen will check them to see if you are still dry and clean. So, let's check your pull UPS and make sure you are in dry and clean pants before heading down to Mrs. Renton's classroom." Joanne didn't know how to respond. She stood there with her hands down by her side holding down her dress. Joanne didn't want to show Mrs. Allen her pull UPS, after the comment made when she arrived this morning. Mrs. Allen already thought she was a little baby kindergartner. If she saw that she was still wearing pull UPS, she would know she was just a baby that didn't belong in 3rd grade. "Joanne," Mrs. Timor prodded. "Are your pull UPS dry and clean?" "Yeah," Joanne hesitantly said. "Can you show me your dry and clean pull UPS?" "See," Joan said, lifting up her dress looking straight at Mrs. Timor. "I am a big girl." "We know you are a big girl, Joanne," Mrs. Timor said, looking at the wet pull UPS and then giving Mrs. Allen a knowing look. While stopping Joanne from lowering her dress, Mrs. Timor turning her around and said, "Now let's check to see if you are clean or messy. We need to check to make sure there is no poopy in the pull-up. I'm a big girl, I go poopy in the potty." We know, Joanne, but sometimes the poopy sneaks out and goes in your pants, doesn't it? No. Well, I don't see any poopy. Good girl, Joanne, Mrs. Timor said, putting down her dress. Let's go. Mrs. Timor took Joanne's hand and led her out of the health room. They quickly arrived at Mrs. Jones' classroom. As they entered the classroom, Joanne quickly looked around the room. Upon spotting Andy, tears started to well up in her eyes. Mommy said I could go to 3rd grade. Do I have to be in Andy's class because I'm wearing pool UPS? I'll use the potty. I promise, Joanne said as tears started to flow. I don't want to be in Andy's class. Andy quickly came over when he saw Joanne in the room crying. No CWI. No CWI, Joanne. Fun toys. Mrs. Jones quickly came over and reassured Andy that Joanne would be okay, and he needed to get back to work and let the grown-ups help Joanne. Mrs. Timor brought Joanne into the bathroom, signaling for Teacher Mary to join them. This isn't your classroom, Joanne, Mrs. Timor tried to reassure Joanne. This is the only changing table in the school, so when you are wearing diapers or have poopy pants, this is where you will come to get changed. You said I know poopy, Joanne got out through her tears. That is right, Joanne, but you are wet and we need to get you changed into a dry diaper. I wet. Joanne lifted up her dress and looked down at her pull-up and feeling it. Mrs. Timor looked up at Teacher Mary and non-verbally indicated that she was to step in at this point. Joanne, I am Teacher Mary. I work in this room and when you need my help, I will be the one changing you. T.E. Teacher Mary. Yes, sweetheart. Why don't we get you up onto the changing table and out of that wet pull-up? Your mom said she didn't pack any extra pool UPS for you today since she didn't expect for you to be staying all day, but you could use one of Andy's diapers, Mrs. Timor interrupted. Are you Andy's little sister? Teacher Mary inquired with added joy to her voice. Yeah, Joanne said in a daze. Well, Teacher Mary continued. When I was changing Andy earlier, I noticed a diaper in his bag that was smaller than the rest. I guess that one is yours. Why don't I get that one out and get you into a nice clean and dry diaper? You wouldn't want one of Andy's big diapers anyways, would you? Much better to wear one that is your size, if we have one available, isn't it now? While this was all going on, Mrs. Timor quietly slipped out of the bathroom. Oh, these are size 7 diapers, big girl diapers. And look, you have Elmo on your diapers, how cute, Teacher Mary rambled on, trying to calm Joanne down as she got everything out. In a barely audible voice, Joanne said, yeah, cute baby diapers. No, Joanne, these are size 7 diapers which are way too big for babies. Only big kids wear these. They are for big kids like you who haven't yet learned how to get all their pee-pee and poopy in the potty. Teacher Mary rambled on, trying to calm Joanne down. Now, let's just tear the sides of the pool UPS and get those yucky wet pool UPS off. Clean you up with a wipe so you don't get diaper rash. Sorry, this is going to be cold. Then Teacher Mary quickly got Joanne changed out of her wet pull-up and into the diaper. By the time she was done, Joanne had stopped crying. Joanne thought Teacher Mary was treating her as if she was lower functioning than Andy. There you go, Joanne, a nice clean and dry diaper for you. I know the first day at a new school can be scary, with a lot of things to worry about. But now you don't have to worry about your pee-pee and poopy, just focus on getting to know the school and the other kids. Let the grown-ups worry about dealing with your pee-pee and poopy today, you just be a cute little girl. As they re-entered the classroom, Andy came running up and gave Joanne a big hug. Joanne better? Dear PDWI. Yes, Andy, Joanne said reluctantly, cracking a smile. I am all better now and I now have a dry diaper on. Goody, Andy said, clapping and dragging Joanne over to the table where he had been working. Cow moo. Cow moo. Joanne looked down at the picture he was pointing to. It was a copied outline of a cow that he had been scribbling all over. Andy picked up a non-colored on sheet and handed it to Joanne. Joanne cow. Cow. I can't color right now, Andy, looking to Mrs. Timor for help and hopeful confirmation. I have to go down to my class. This is your class, not mine. Okay, and with that Andy sat down and continued scribbling all over his cow picture. Who that, Andy? A little girl at the table asked. Sissy Joanne, Andy said with a smile. Mrs. Timor came up and directed Joanne to the door. You're in diapers now, Joanne, so when your teacher tells you it is time to go get changed, this is where you will come. Now let's go meet Mrs. Renton and the rest of your classmates in 3rd grade. Chapter 5. 3rd grade. Mrs. Timor brought Joanne down the hall to the 3rd grade classrooms. Joanne could hear her diapers making a ton of noise with every step. They stopped in front of a bulletin board with a tree and multicolor leaves on and around it that looked like kids had made them. The board read, Fall into Learning in Mrs. Renton's class. This is it, Joanne, ready? No, Joanne quietly said. As they both stood there in silence, Joanne took a deep breath and squeezed Mrs. Timor's hand very tight. Just take me down to kindergarten or back to Andy's room. Mrs. Renton doesn't want a baby in her class. Mrs. Timor got down on her knees and looked Joanne right in the eyes. Now you listen very carefully, Joanne. Mrs. Renton wants you in her class. She knows you have trouble getting your pee-pee and poopy in the potty and sometimes have to wear pull UPS or diapers, but she still asked to be your teacher. Mrs. Renton wants you in her class. Really? Joanne asked on the verge of tears again. Really, Joanne, she really doesn't care about the diapers and pull UPS. She heard about a smart cute little girl coming and she wants to meet that 3rd grader. The other kids are going to tease me. Mrs. Renton and I will not allow that, Joanne. Here at Learning Time we have a strict rule about teasing. It is not allowed. If anyone is caught teasing, they get in big trouble and their mommy and daddy are called. If any of the kids tease you, just tell Mrs. Renton or any of the teachers in the school and they will make sure it never happens again. Looking at Joanne, Mrs. Timor smiled and squeezed her 2 hands before standing up. Let's go meet Mrs. Renton and the other kids. Joanne reluctantly went with Mrs. Timor into the classroom. Dressed in a little kid's frilly dress, with pigtails and diapers, she definitely did not feel like a 3rd grader as she walked into Mrs. Renton's 3rd grade classroom. They found all the kids sitting quietly at their desks working. Mrs. Renton was kneeling down next to one of the desks helping a child. It only took a few seconds for them to be noticed and have all eyes on them. Well, class, it looks like we have a new student, Mrs. Renton said, coming over to Joanne. Welcome. I am Mrs. Renton. Joanne meekly smiled at Mrs. Renton. Mrs. Renton, meet Joanne Musi, Mrs. Timor did the introductions. She just moved here from Denver. I am sure you and your students will make her feel welcome. I have a spot over here next to Sally set up for you, Joanne, Mrs. Renton said while directing Joanne over to a desk next to a girl with black wavy hair. Upon reaching the desk, Mrs. Renton reached inside it and pulled out a name tag, placing it on the desk. It already has her name on it, Sally said in surprise. How'd you do that? Teacher magic, Sally, Mrs. Renton said, winking at Joanne. Okay, class, everyone back to work on your math sheet while I get Joanne settled in. While Mrs. Renton was up getting Joanne a pencil and worksheet, the headmaster handed her a note and slipped out of the room. Mrs. Renton quickly looked at the note that just had 4 words on it. diapers today, just changed, and then smiled over at Joanne, who was looking straight at her. Don't worry, Joanne, Sally quietly said before Mrs. Renton got back. We are just doing addition with regrouping today. Looking over at Sally's worksheet, it looked like something Joanne could do. Then she looked around the room. Most of the kids were focused on their math worksheet. The room had a lot kids' work posted at various places around the classroom. There was a corner of the room with books and some computers at the back of the classroom. Here, Joanne, Mrs. Renton interrupted her observations. Do as much as you can before we switch subjects in about 10 minutes. If you have any questions, Sally here can help you learn how we do things in this class. I'll help her, Mrs. Renton, Sally happily said. Mrs. Renton ignored the chatter between Sally and Joanne over the next 10 minutes. After about 10 minutes, Mrs. Renton told the class to hand in their papers and return to their seats. Class, I have a special project for us to do that I planned when I heard we were getting a new student. I am hoping this will help Joanne learn about all of you and be something fun to do. We are going to write about ourselves and draw a picture of ourselves to hang up in the hall. I have a special large sheet of paper for you all to draw a picture of yourselves from head to toe. I don't want just your face or just your top, I want to see your whole body in the picture, and the picture is to take up the whole page with the top of your head at the top of the page and your feet at the bottom. Once the murmur stopped, Mrs. Renton continued, our writing assignment is going to tell Joanne and others about you. Maybe the easy way to start this is to turn it around and ask all of you what you would like to know about Joanne. How old is she? Does she have any brothers or sisters? Does she like to play jump rope at recess? For several minutes the children continued to throw out questions they wanted to ask Joanne. Then Mrs. Renton went to the board and started to narrow down the questions and put some of them up on the board. It took about 5 minutes before one of the kids was instructed to hand out writing paper, and Mrs. Renton outlined the assignment. Class, the first paragraph will tell the reader things like name, age, hair and eye color, along with information about your family. Your second paragraph will tell the reader about what you like to do, favorite color, and other information that make you different from other kids. Your third paragraph. Mrs. Renton was interrupted by a collective groan. Like I was saying, your third paragraph will be about what you want to be when you grow up, including an explanation of why you want to be that. You are all third graders now and you need to learn how to write 3-paragraph papers. Now, you need to have at least your first paragraph done before you can go to morning recess, so start writing. The recess bell rings in 15 minutes. Turning to Sally, quietly Joanne asked, does she always give long writing assignments? No, we have only had to write paragraphs twice before, and those were only 2 paragraphs. Figures she would make things harder on my first day. Both girls giggled as they wrote their names on the papers. Joanne found that Mrs. Renton tolerated some conversation during the assignment, but it couldn't get too noisy in the room. Mrs. Renton also gave countdown warnings at 10 and 5 minutes till the recess bell. When the recess bell rang, Mrs. Renton asked who had finished the first paragraph. Everyone raised their hands. She dismissed everyone to recess, asking Sally and Joanne to stay. Sally, why don't you go have recess with Molly and bring Joanne? I bet she would love to meet her. Can we really? Joanne, you are going to like Molly, Sally said with glee. Sally, go pick out 2 books you two can read to the kids in Molly's class while I talk to Joanne for a minute. As soon as Sally had bounced off to the other side of the classroom, Mrs. Renton kneeled down next to Joanne's seat. Joanne, you're wearing diapers today and we need a way for me to tell you to go get your diapers changed without me saying it out loud to the whole class. I figured a secret code would work, so when I pull on my ear, that means you need to go get checked or changed. It can work the other way too. If you get my attention and pull on your ear, it will tell me you need to go get changed. What if the other kids find out? I don't think it is going to be a problem, but we can deal with that when it happens. Don't worry, I won't let anyone tease you, Joanne. Now go with Sally to meet Molly. It looks like Sally is at the door waiting for you. Chapter 6. Siblings. So who is Molly? Joanne asked as they headed down the hall. Here, you take this one, it is her favorite, Sally said, handing Joanne a book called Biscuit Goes to School. Molly's my sister. Looking down at the book and flipping through a few pages, so, is she in kindergarten? No, she is my twin sister, Sally said, skipping down the hall. And this is her favorite book? Joanne questioned with confusion. The book was clearly for preschoolers or kindergartners. How could this be a third grader's favorite book? You are going to like Molly and the kids in her class. They are real fun to play with and there are neat toys in there. Mrs. Renton lets me and one other kid from the class have a few recesses a week in Molly's classroom. Doesn't your sister's third grade class go outside to recess like ours? They have recess, but not at the same time. Anyways, it is more fun in her classroom than playing with her outside. Joanne wasn't looking where they were going. She was trying to figure this out and looking at the book. The book Sally had in her hands was also a biscuit book. Were they supposed to read these to the third graders in Molly's classroom? Joanne was looking at the biscuit book in confusion as they entered a classroom. She stopped looking at the book and looked at the classroom they had just entered. Without thinking, she blurted out the first thing that entered her mind, "But I don't need to be changed." What, Joanne? Sally asked in confusion. Joanne looked at Sally's confused expression. What are we doing in Mrs. Jones' classroom? You know Mrs. Jones? How do you know Mrs. Jones? This is your first day. Before Joanne could answer, a girl looking exactly like Sally came up and hugged her from behind. Hi, Sally. Hi, Joanne. What? Sally questioned, looking at Joanne. How do you know Molly? Before Joanne could answer, Sally turned around and looked at the girl hugging her. Sally asked, "Wait a minute. Molly, how do you know Joanne?" "Joanne Andy Sissy," Molly said in a matter-of-fact manner, and then walked away. In a dazed state, Sally said to no one in particular, "Who is Andy?" "Andy is my brother," Joanne explained. "He is the one over there playing with the Fisher-Price school bus next to Molly." "What? Who? Where?" Sally looked at Joanne, then turned to look at her sister and the new boy playing next to her. "So you have a brother in here? Do you think Mrs. Renton knew that when she put you next to me?" "Yeah, Mrs. Renton probably knows about Andy," Joanne said. In an effort to change the topic, she asked, "So Sally, what do we do in here during recess?" "Well, we read a book to one of the kids in the class, then we play with the kids. I gave you Molly's favorite, so you can read to Molly. I will read to your brother. That way we are sharing our brother and sister." The two girls giggled as Mrs. Jones approached. "Hi, Joanne." "Hi, Sally. Are you two here to play with the kids?" "Yes, Mrs. Jones," Sally said with a smile as she grabbed Joanne's hand and headed over to Molly. "Molly, Andy, it is story time." "Joanne," Andy said, clapping. "School bus. School bus. Yes, it is a nice school bus, Andy. Now it is time to hear a story. This is Sally. She is going to read you a story about a dog named Biscuit." "Biscuit story? Me want Biscuit story." "Sally, wed me Biscuit," Molly pleaded. "Not today, Molly, but Joanne here is going to read you Biscuit Goes to School." "Biscuit go school, yeah," Molly clapped. She then stood up and dragged Joanne over to a beanbag chair in a corner of the room and pulled her down into the chair. Sitting next to Joanne, Molly said, wed Biscuit." Joanne read Molly the story and, on Molly's insistence, read it a second time. After reading the story, Molly got down on the floor with a toy car, pushing a button on top of it. The car rolled over and bumped into the bin bag chair Joanne was still sitting in. Sliding forward out of the chair and onto the floor, Joanne pressed the button and sent the car back to Molly. While the car was going back and forth, Joanne would occasionally look over to Andy and Sally. After the book, they started playing with the school bus. Sally showed Andy how to put the people into the seats on the bus. She also showed him about a magic back door where a wheelchair could get on the bus. Andy would try to copy Sally, but not always have success with his efforts. Sally was always very helpful when he struggled and assisted him to achieve his goal. Sally would occasionally look over to Joanne and Molly. Her focus, however, did not end up on what Molly and Joanne were doing, but on Joanne and something that didn't make sense. When Joanne slipped out of the bin bag chair, her dress slipped up around her waist. Then, with her legs spread to receive the car going back and forth, Sally could easily see Joanne's diaper. It was the same kind of diaper Molly wore. Sally did not question what she was seeing, she just didn't understand. It did explain Joanne's statement when they entered the room. Joanne must come here to get her diapers changed. Teacher Mary came up to Joanne and Sally and told them that recess was over and it was time to go back to class. After saying goodbye, the girls headed back to Mrs. Renton's classroom. Sally started to slow down on the trip back. Joanne, you need to be more careful at school not to show off your diapers. I don't wear diapers, Joanne lied. I saw them, Joanne, they are the same type Molly wears. I won't tell anyone. I promise. Mommy has threatened to send me to school in diapers when I call Molly a baby. In Sally's best impersonation of her mother, she said, Sally, stop teasing your sister. Maybe I should just treat you like Molly and send you to school in diapers, then you would learn how hard she has it. My mom doesn't like me teasing Andy either. Yeah, Andy is just like Molly, Sally said. No, not really. Joanne paused for a moment. Sally, please don't tell the other kids I am wearing diapers. I won't, but you need to be more careful. Everyone in Mrs. Jones' room could see your diapers. Since almost all the kids in there wear diapers or pull UPS, it doesn't matter, but you need to be careful other places in the school, especially in a dress. Molly shows off her diapers all the time while wearing a dress. I'll help remind you not to show your diapers. The two were silent the rest of the way back to class. When they got back to class, the other kids were just settling down to continue on their project. Joanne was surprised by the disappointment in the other kids, that they didn't get to go down to Mrs. Jones' classroom. I had fun playing with the new kid, Sally said to a boy, giving Joanne a wink. What you do, play dollies with Joanne, the boy replied. No, Molly was saving the Barbie dolls for when you go down, Billy. I had fun playing with the new boy in Mrs. Jones' class. With that, Sally turned around and got to work on her paper. Joanne heard the murmur going around the room about a new boy in Mrs. Jones' class. Several of the kids tried to get Sally to tell them about the boy, but she ignored them and continued working. Every now and then she would look over to Joanne and the two girls would giggle. Sally finally got so fed up with the bugging, she turned around and said in a fairly loud voice, "Stop it already. You're asking the wrong person anyways. Joanne knows more about him than I do." Okay, everyone back to work, Mrs. Renton interrupted. Joanne can tell you all about Andy during lunch recess. If she wants to, and if I was her, I wouldn't want to if everyone under the sun was bugging me. Now get back to work. The room went silent as everyone shut up and started writing. Joanne and Mrs. Renton looked at each other and smiled, before Mrs. Renton non-verbally prompted Joanne to also get to work. It wasn't long before everyone had their 3 paragraphs done and handed in. The next assignment was self-portrait. Shortly before lunch, Mrs. Renton started calling kids up to the front of the class to read their report to the class. She said it was a way for Joanne to learn about everyone in the class. Just before lunch, about half the kids had read their reports. When Mrs. Renton called Joanne up, she said she would be the last one to read their reports before lunch. "It is about time, this is the report we have all been waiting to hear," Billy blurted out. "Billy," Mrs. Renton reprimanded. "For that statement I should make Joanne go last, but for Joanne's sanity at lunch, let's hear her report." Joanne went up to the front of the classroom, more scared than she had been entering the room at the beginning of the day. Mrs. Renton handed her the report she had written. Joanne stood in front of the class in pure terror, unable to move or speak. Sally prodded her onward. "My name is Joanne Samantha Musée. I am 8 years old. I have blue." Joanne read through her report, not looking up from the paper. There was a quiet hum throughout the room when she read that she had a brother named Andy. She ended her report by telling everyone about wanting to be an astronaut and starting a colony on Mars. Everyone clapped as Joanne brought her paper back over to Mrs. Renton. Handing the paper over, Joanne heard Mrs. Renton sniff 2 times and then saw her tug on her ear. Joanne put her head down and started heading for the door. She heard Mrs. Renton telling the rest of the class about finishing the pictures of themselves after lunch and hearing the rest of the reports. Joanne slipped out of the room with few kids noticing. Joanne's secret. Entering Mrs. Jones' room, Joanne found everyone sitting down at 2 tables. Most of the kids had bibs on and were sitting in front of a tray of food with a sippy cup. Andy was one of the kids wearing a bib and drinking from a sippy cup. Teacher Mary was cutting up some food on Andy's plate. Upon seeing Joanne, she got up from the table and joined Joanne. To Joanne's displeasure, she had to wear one of Andy's diapers when her poopy diaper was changed. His were bigger and a lot noisier since they didn't have a cloth-like backing. Teacher Mary quickly had her changed and heading back out into Mrs. Jones' classroom. Joanne wasn't too sure she wanted to go to the cafeteria for lunch after this. Joanne was surprised to see Sally talking to Molly when she entered the classroom. Upon seeing Joanne, Sally said goodbye to Molly and headed over to Joanne. "Done? Let's go to lunch." "How did you know I was here?" "When I saw you leave the classroom, it wasn't hard to figure out. I bet even Molly could have figured it out. I waited to be the last one out of the classroom and asked Mrs. Renton if you had come down here to get your diapers changed. Then I asked if I could come down and help you get to lunch. Did any of the other kids ask where I went?" "Not that I noticed." "Come on, let's go to lunch. I want to get there before the 5th graders, they always take the good seats." Reluctantly, Joanne followed Sally. After passing a few classrooms, Sally stated, "Those diapers make a lot of noise. Are they different from the ones you were wearing earlier?" "They're Andy's. I can't wait till I can get my panties back." "You don't always wear diapers?" Sally asked with surprise. "No, Mom said I had to wear pull UPS to school for the next 2 weeks because I wet my pants at the store last weekend." Sally, confused over the contradiction between what Joanne said versus what she knew Joanne was wearing, was unable to get any more information because they had entered the cafeteria. Sally showed Joanne the lunchroom procedures, and then they got a seat by the windows, with some of the other 3rd graders. "What took you two so long?" one of the girls from Mrs. Renton's class asked. "We were checking in on Molly and Andy before coming to lunch," Sally said, smiling at Joanne as she sat down. At lunch, the other kids asked Joanne a lot of questions about where she moved from and what her likes were. Joanne was surrounded by kids all the way through lunch and recess. She was worried that kids would hear her noisy diapers, but in all the questions, no one asked about the noise. Joanne was happy to go in from recess. It meant an end to the crowds of people and back to just her and Sally. The afternoon went quick. The class finished their pictures of themselves and got to hang them on the bulletin board replacing the tree and leaves. The rest of the students did their oral presentations of their reports. Afterwards, there was a spelling activity putting the words in alphabetical order. Joanne was feeling like a member of the class as they lined up for music. Once the class was quiet, Mrs. Renton led them down the hall. Sally was in front of Joanne and could hear the diaper crinkling as they walked. Ellen, directly behind Joanne, could hear crinkling that sounded like someone was unwrapping some hard candy. Another class was still in music when they arrived, so they had to wait out in the hall. Ellen whispered to Joanne, "Could I have a piece of candy?" "I don't have any candy," Joanne said confused. "Yeah, you do. I heard you unwrapping a piece when we came down here," Ellen insisted. "Ellen, no talking, Mrs. Renton said. "But Joanne has candy and is not sharing it." "Joanne," Mrs. Renton said, coming up to the kids. "Give me the candy." "I don't have any candy, Mrs. Renton," Joanne stated. "Yes, she does," Ellen insisted. "I heard her unwrapping the candy in her pocket as we walked down the hall." Sally went wide-eyed and stared at Joanne. "Let's see what is in your pockets, Joanne," Mrs. Renton calmly asked. Confused, Joanne said, "I don't have any pockets in this dress, Mrs. Renton." "Mrs. Renton," Sally interrupted. "Joanne doesn't have any candy, it was her. Her. You know." Mrs. Renton looked at Sally for a moment with confusion and then figured it out. Looking at Ellen, she said, "Well, Ellen, she said she doesn't have any candy and she doesn't have any pockets to hide any, so you must have heard something else. Now it is time to be quiet in line. So, no more talking, please." As Mrs. Renton headed back to the front of the line, the other class came out of the music room. Joanne stood there trying to figure out what had just happened. She started to move her fingers along the frills and ruffles near the bottom of her dress. Very shortly the class was on their way into the music room. The kids went to take their spots on a 3-tiered set of risers. The music teacher stopped Joanne at the door. "Hi Joanne, I am Mr. Oliver, the music teacher. We have been practicing for the Christmas program. Everyone has a spot where they are to stand for the program. Now we need to find your perfect spot." Mr. Oliver said, looking back and forth between Joanne and the kids on the risers. "You are a little one, aren't you, Joanne, Mr. Oliver asked, getting down in front of Joanne holding both of her hands. "Do you know the song Jingle Bells?" "Yeah. Can you sing some of it for me?" "Okay. Jingle bells. Jingle bells. Jingle all the ways," Joanne meekly started, more saying than singing. "Oh, what fun it is to run on a one-horsey open sled." Some of the other kids in the room were giggling, but were silenced by a stare from Mr. Oliver. "That was a good first try, sweetie. Now I want you to sing it again, but this time, sing it nice and loud. Pretend you are in the gym and your mommy and daddy are way on the other side of the gym. Let's hear your nice pretty voice sing it nice and loud." Joanne tried to turn to look at Sally, but Mr. Oliver had turned her so her back was to the kids and was still holding both of her hands. "Okay," Joanne said, taking a deep breath. "Jingle bells, jingle all the ways. Oh, what fun it is to run on a one-horsey open sleigh." Several of the kids clapped at the end, making Joanne smile. "That was much better, Mr. Oliver said with a big smile. "We need to teach you a few of the correct words, but with that nice strong voice and intonation, let's put you in the front row, center." Mr. Oliver brought her over to the center of the first row and put her directly in the middle. Joanne looked around and found Sally 1 row back over to one side and Ellen was 2 rows back on the other side. There was a girl on one side of her and a boy on the other. Mr. Oliver handed out a packet of songs and then went up to a podium in front of the class. We will sing through the first 2 songs with the papers and then try them without the papers. They sang Deck the Halls and Jingle Bells and then were instructed to put their papers on the spot behind them. Then they went through the same 2 songs again. Joanne switched from a nice strong voice while reading the songs, to a quiet timid one once the papers were put down. Joanne would look down at her dress and started playing with the lace and frills at the hem of her dress. "Class, Mr. Oliver said when they finished the 2 songs without the papers. "Let's practice those songs again without the papers, but this time I will be playing on the piano." Groaning throughout the room stopped with a look, as Mr. Oliver headed over to the keyboard. Joanne didn't like singing without the papers since she didn't know all the words. She played more with the hem of her dress. They were halfway through their 4th time singing the 2 songs when Mr. Oliver noticed that Joanne was wearing a diaper, because she was playing with her dress and exposing the diaper. He made a mental note to tell her parents to have her wear bloomers or shorts under her dress on the day of the Christmas program. After the 4th run-through, he had the kids sit down and look at the packet of songs. He had the group sing through all 5 songs in the program. Joanne was relieved when she saw Mrs. Renton enter the room. The group finished the song they were on and then lined up. Once the class was lined up, Mrs. Renton asked Joanne to go down and check on Andy while pulling on her ear. Chapter 8. End of day. Joanne was humming Jingle Bells as she walked down the hall, trying to remember the correct words. As she walked into Mrs. Jones' classroom, she found the kids sitting on the floor listening to a story. "Hello Joanne, come on over here and listen to the story till Teacher Mary is done changing Molly," Mrs. Jones stated. "No, I am just here to check on Andy." Mrs. Renton told me to come down and check on Andy. "Oh sweetie, I am sure she just told you that so the other kids didn't know you were coming down to get your diapers changed. Come over here and have a seat next to your big brother." Joanne stopped smiling as she faced the reality. As she walked over to Mrs. Jones, she recalled Mrs. Renton pulling on her ear when she gave the directions. Sitting down, she looked at Andy. He was sucking on his thumb, smiling at her. Joanne rolled her eyes up and shook her head back and forth. "Let's see, where were we?" "Corroy going cave," one of the kids in the class said. Joanne was upset about being tricked by Mrs. Renton. She was sent down to get changed when she wasn't even wet or messy. Joanne pulled up her dress and looked at her diaper to confirm her thoughts. Andy's diapers had a strip on them that changed color when they were wet. To Joanne's utter disappointment, she could see the line had changed color. Quickly putting her dress down, she focused on Mrs. Jones. "Yes, Corduroy had climbed into what he thought was a cave," Mrs. Jones said. "It wasn't a cave though, was it?" "Who knows what it was?" "Bagcoase," Andy said, smiling with pride. "Yes, Corduroy had just climbed into a bag of wet clothes that he thought was a cave," Mrs. Jones confirmed. "Who can guess what will happen next?" Me, a boy about Andy's size said while raising his hand. Mrs. Jones looked around at the kids and noticed that everyone had their hands up, including Joanne. Turning to the boy, she said, "Marcus, what will happen?" "Corduroy get all wet and go for a train ride," Marcus said with confidence. "Well, let's keep going with the story and see if Marcus is right," Mrs. Jones said, opening back up the book. She started reading where she had left off from. Before the story was over, Teacher Mary and Molly came back and sat down to listen to the story. Joanne didn't get up to get changed, because she wanted to hear the end of the story. While Mrs. Jones was asking the kids questions about the story, Teacher Mary brought Joanne back to get changed. Teacher Mary quickly set out getting Joanne up on the changing table. "Let's get you changed and back to class. The day is almost over, you don't want to miss the end of your first day." "Yes, I do." "Oh Joanne, it couldn't have been that bad." You made a friend, didn't you? Sally. Joanne quietly thought about whether or not Sally was her friend. Looks like you didn't quite get all your poopy out this morning, just a little bit to clean up here, Teacher Mary said as she wiped Joanne's bottom. Do you really think Sally is my friend? Yes, Joanne, Sally needs a true friend just like you do. I've seen the way she cares for you, almost the same way she cares for Molly. She would only do that for a sister, Teacher Mary snugly taped up the diaper. Or, a friend. Joanne thought about what Teacher Mary had said all the way back to class. Was Sally really her friend? Had she made a friend on the first day of school, a friend that knew she sometimes wore and used diapers? Entering class, the other kids were in groups of 2 drilling each other with math problems. Getting to her desk, she found Sally waiting for her. Took you long enough, Sally said jokingly. It's your sister's fault. Oh, Sally asked questioningly. She took forever getting her diapers changed, so I got to enjoy story time. Mrs. Jones was reading A Pocket for Corduroy. I like that story. I have a teddy that looks like corduroy, Sally said with a smile. You might want to read it to Molly tonight. She missed a lot of the story getting changed. The two of them giggled as Sally handed Joanne half the stack of math flashcards she had and they started to drill each other. Several minutes into the activity, Joanne's mind drifted back to the conversation with Teacher Mary. Was Sally really her friend? They did many more math problems before Joanne meekly asked, "Are you my friend?" Sally giggled. Joanne was heartbroken. She just knew deep in her heart that the giggle meant Sally wasn't her friend. Oh, we are best friends, you silly, Sally said, taking Joanne's hands and getting down into her line of sight. Best friends. Really? Really? Best friends, Sally confidently stated. The two girls continued to do the assignment with occasional side talk. Sally couldn't ask the question she wanted, since other kids were close by. Sally was disappointed when Mrs. Renton told everyone to put stuff away and get ready to go home. This meant she wouldn't find out today about why Joanne was in diapers, when she said she came to school in Pool UPS. The girls said bye to each other as they headed off to their moms who were waiting in their cars. Did you have a good day, sweetie, Mrs. Musi asked Joanne as the car door closed. It was okay, but it would have been better if I didn't have to wear diapers. Sorry, princess. Tomorrow I will make sure you have enough Pool UPS to change into. Mrs. Musi was interrupted by the car door opening and Andy climbed into his car seat. Mrs. Jones helped Andy get strapped into his seat. She told Mrs. Musi how good Andy was today and that she was looking forward to seeing Andy again tomorrow. I am really glad you were a good boy, Andy, Mrs. Musi said. Me good boy. Me good, Andy said, clapping his hands. Mrs. Jones said goodbye to Andy and started to close the door. Say goodbye to Mrs. Jones, Andy, Mrs. Musi stressed. Bye-bye, teacher, Andy said, holding up his hand and opening and closing it at Mrs. Jones. Bye, Andy. Bye, Joanne. With that, Mrs. Jones closed the door and walked away. So, did either of you make any friends today? Yeah, I made friends with Sally, Joanne said as the car pulled out of the school driveway. Did anyone find out about your diapers, Joanne, Mrs. Musi asked with concern. Sally had to have found out, Andy answered for Joanne. Joanne was showing off her diapers to everyone in my class after she read Molly that biscuit book. Sally and I could easily see them from where we were. Oh, and you know, Joanne, Molly thinks you are her friend too. She talked about you a lot after you read her that biscuit book. She doesn't count, Joanne insisted. She is in your class, not mine. That may be, Joanne, Andy said. But she is Sally's twin sister, so she is your age. Okay, you too, Mrs. Musi tried to stop the coming dispute before it got out of hand. So, Joanne has a new friend named Sally, who has a twin sister in Andy's class who also likes Joanne. Sounds like Joanne had quite a day. Did anyone else find out about the diapers? No one in my class, Joanne said. That is good. Did you like your teacher? Mrs. Renton was nice. She set up a secret code when she wants to tell me to go get my diapers changed. She just tugs on her ear. That sounds nice. Andy, how about you? Do you like your teacher, Mrs. Musi asked. She was great, Mom. Both Mrs. Jones and teacher Mary treated me like I was just a little kid. They even put a bib on me at lunchtime and had me drink out of a sippy cup. Can I really go back and play again tomorrow, Mom? If you can keep convincing them that you are 2 years old, then you can stay. And as I have said before, you have to keep up with your schoolwork. If you start falling behind, I will not let you go to learning time anymore, Mrs. Musi stated. Thanks, Mom, Andy acknowledged. I am ahead at the moment, or at least I will be once I finish my paper on the Oregon Trail. You haven't finished that yet, Mrs. Musi questioned. It is almost done, Mom, Andy tried to calm her. I have 4 out of 5 pages. I should be able to finish it up this afternoon. Well, Andy, Mrs. Musi said in a very motherly tone. No more reading the Harry Potter books till you are done. Oh, Mom. The end.
The ritual of discipline. When I was growing up in the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s, it seemed to me that every child got his or her bottom smacked at one time or other. Most of the time it was an impromptu spanking, the culprit hauled unceremoniously over the irate parent's or guardian's lap, and a flurry of smacks landed on whatever part of the struggling culprit's clothed anatomy was available to the descending hand. Not in our home, though. Corporal punishment, when carried out on me, or my siblings, there were 7 of us with me second oldest, took the form of a ritualized ceremony. Mother was the prime disciplinarian, father only played a role if you were stupid enough to resist. In that case you got a thrashing from father, with his hard hand, then he left you to the tender mercies of mother, who proceeded to give you the same smacked bottom as you would have gotten originally. We learned early to cooperate. Let me describe to you what I would call the stages of the discipline in itself. The call. There was something in the way mother called Megan that sent shivers up my spine. I just knew from the tone I was in big trouble. I would slowly enter the living room, a slight flicker of hope that perhaps I was mistaken. But a glance at mother's face as she sat cross-legged on one of the soft padded chairs, staring hard at me, her mouth set, told me to abandon hope. Sometimes the call took a little longer, when I was dispatched to school, with a sound whop on my skirt-clad bottom, and we'll see about that when you get home, young lady, ringing in my ears, as I made my way down the driveway to the school bus. All day I sat at my desk watching the big second hand on the wall clock push the minute and our hands closer and closer to quitting time and my awaiting fate. That walk up the drive, with some of my brothers and sisters, seeing mother at the door, her arms folded under her ample bosom, her legs apart, eyes flinty, as she snapped, "Hurry up, Megan." The lecture. The lecture was always long and excruciatingly painful mentally, though not physically. Physical pain was to come. Mother was an expert in getting the truth, and twisting your words to make them even more incriminating. I would stand in front of mother, hands wringing, shifting my weight from foot to foot, feeling the emotions rising from the pit of my stomach, and trying to choke back the tears, as I tried desperately to think of any way to get out of what was about to happen. Her bosom heaving, she would cross and uncross her legs, as the tone of her lecture, an interrogation, rose and fell. I can still hear that soft swish from her nylons, as her thighs brushed together, and I glanced down at her large lap, picturing myself across it, yelping from the pain. Often father would be sitting in there, as would one or two of my brothers or sisters, pretending to do homework, or reading a book, but really focused on what mother was saying, and glancing from time to time taking in my discomfiture. I had watched my sibs in the same predicament, so knew just how enjoyable and exciting they were finding the whole thing. And so glad it was not them. The walk. Like all good things, the lecture finally drew to a close. Was it a relief? Maybe. Hard to tell. My mind by that time would be spinning, my stomach would be in knots, my hands would be dabbing tears from my eyes, my knees would be quaking, and I would be trying desperately not to cause too much of a scene in front of my siblings, and certainly not in front of father, in case he determined I was resisting a little too much. Mother would stand, heavily, and smooth the front of her skirt down over her ample thighs. With a curt, "Come along, Megan." Normally I was Meg, but if my bottom was in trouble, it was always Megan. She took me firmly by the shoulder or arm, and we walked slowly out of the living room across the hall into the bathroom. Mother always used the bathroom when we were younger, if we were due a smacked bottom. I think she liked the idea of its closeness, and the privacy it gave her when she locked the door. Although, as I will tell you in detail later, she would on occasion leave the door ajar, if she wanted an audience to really appreciate what a smacked bottom was all about in our home. In our later years, the lecture was the same, but we were then dispatched alone to our bedroom, via hers to pick up the strap or cane, to prepare. That meant, I would face the wall, facing the door, and await mother's arrival. But here I am describing a bathroom spanking. I can still remember the awful click that lock made, emphasizing all was lost. The bathroom. The bathroom was big, large white porcelain tub and toilet. There was linoleum on the floor, which had such a floor wax, musty, urine smell when my nose was pressed to it, as I lay over mother's lap. White ceramic tiles covered the walls. There was a big wooden vanity, with a large white sink set in it, and a couple of cupboard doors below, and a big mirror above. The acoustics in that room were superb in that the sounds of hand or hairbrush impacting with my buttocks, my mother's stern lecturing, and my yelps and cries, would reverberate off the wall and mix together into such a cacophony of sound. I know when I listened to one of my sibs get it in the bathroom, the sounds were incredible. To this day, bathrooms have a special place in my psyche. When I visit my parents, I still walk into that room, a little trepidation in my heart. The room preparation. Having firmly locked the door, mother would turn and sternly stare at me, looking for even a trace of resistance, then brush by and bend heavily at the waist, legs straight, and open up the cupboard below the sink. I was faced by her bottom, the material of her skirt pulled tight across it. What would it be like to smack that, I wondered. I never tried, of course. As well as the bottom facing me, I noted mother's skirt had ridden up, and I had a good view of the tops of her nylons, the straining elastic garters, the frilly hem of her corset, and the expanse of white thigh-tween stocking top and corset. I wondered if my brothers had experienced such a view, and what they thought of it. She rose heavily, her face florid from the exertion of bending, as she turned to face me, slapping the hairbrush, large oval Canadian maple wood, on her left palm. My heart sank even further. She laid the brush on the side of the bath, then took the bath mat and laid it down in the middle of the floor, pushing me roughly aside. Then one leg at a time, she knelt down on the bath mat, sat back on her heels facing me, and with her hand guided me in front. My preparation. The lecture renewed. Oh, how well she described what I had done wrong and what was about to happen. My tears started anew and I tried a little pleading, but I knew it was to no avail. Never did mother put me over her lap, then let me up unsmacked. As she lectured, she reached for the hairbrush, and I quickly withdrew. I know only too well what a crack on the knuckles feels like from that brush. Not like my best friend Jill. She gets spanked too, but by her father mostly. He takes her over his lap and smacks over her skirt or slacks. The spanking. Satisfied that I am properly prepared, mother pulls me to her right side. I shuffle, trying not to trip. I look down at the skirt-clad lap below me. Time to go over. She half hauls, half pushes me over her lap. I kind of resist, but dare not. I place my hands on the floor on her left side and lower myself onto her lap. How hard the linoleum feels on my elbows and knees, and how soft does her lap feel. She carefully adjusts my hips so that my bottom is ideally placed for a sound smacking. I clasp my fingers together, to ensure my hands don't stray over my bottom to provide protection, press my head onto the floor, squeeze, and clench my buttocks as tight together as I can, to make as small a target as possible, and pray for deliverance. It never came. As mother gazes down, she lectures some more, then raises her right hand and smack, brings it down full across both the widest, plumpest portion of both cheeks. No matter how often I am spanked, nothing can prepare me for the pain of that first smack. I try to imagine what it will be like, but when it arrives it is always 10 times worse than I remembered. The cane and strap are even worse if that is possible. Mother starts up a steady rhythm of lecturing and spanking. I always try to be brave, but as the spanking continues and the pain increases I start to blubber, then really cry. I am aware initially that my brothers and sisters will be listening. I have heard them in distress often myself, but with the pain I really do not care what they hear. From my own experience, I know now that mother smacked until her hand was too uncomfortable to continue. She then picked up the hairbrush from the side of the bath and delivered a few vigorous smack. All over my bottom and halfway down my thigh. The pain is so bad, my fingers release and my hand shoots back to cover. Mother pauses, and says, "Megan. 2 seconds to move that. 1. 2. Smack." I was too slow and feel the pain lancing up my arm from the crack on the knuckles she gives me. My hand withdraws rapidly and I hold it tightly with my other as the hairbrush continues its round of my buttocks and highs. By the time she finally stops, my crying is hoarse and I am one well-punished young lady. The finale. With a contemptuous push, mother spills me off her lap onto the floor, where I lay, like a little hedgehog, curled in a ball, my hands squeezing my bottom, trying desperately to ease the pain. With an "I hope you have learned a good lesson today, Meg," mother unlocks the door, shutting it behind her. It is over except for the embarrassment of facing my father and my brothers and sisters. Though since my siblings have often gotten the same. I really do not understand why it was so.
Jolene wasn't a fan of the forest, in the best of times. Now, as she found herself being dragged from the back seat of the car and into it, she couldn't have said if they were in the heart of it, or just beyond the road. It had felt like an eternity since they'd left the main road, the car bouncing with every little bump, but that didn't mean much of anything. She managed to get on her feet when she was taken from the car, although she found herself stumbling and slipping as her captor led her around to the front of the car, finally falling onto her squishy bottom as the figure turned her loose, pushing her forward. Jolene didn't try to stand, simply scuttled back a foot or two more, staring forward. The headlights of the car were still on, shining brightly in her eyes, but she could make out the outline of the other person, standing there. It was another young woman, slim but somewhat on the tall side, hair wild and unkempt, one hand wrapped tight around a baseball bat, the end of which had apparently been carved down to a point. If Jolene could have seen the other girl's face, perhaps she would have recognized her. It's hard to tell, it had been a long few years since she had seen her, years that hadn't been particularly kind to either of them. The other girl, Patty, her relatives had called her, back when she had them, and Pax to her friends, when she'd had those, and carved into the handle of the bat, remembered her, however. "There's always two," said Patty. It had been said to her once, long ago, and she'd never forgotten it. She spoke the words aloud again now to steel her resolve, though it didn't take much. Evil births evil. Jolene was pretty certain she wasn't evil, but she knew that wasn't the sort of thing you could judge in yourself. Of the other thing, however, she was certain, even if she was less sure if it had been directed at her, or just a statement. "There's only one of me," she said quietly. That was not the correct answer. A wordless scream of rage erupted from Patty's throat, and Jolene found herself doubled over, mouth open as she gasped for air. She'd never broken a rib before, or any other part of her body, but she was pretty sure she now knew just what that felt like as Patty pulled her baseball bat back again. "Where?" Patty demanded. The word was strong, definite. There was only one thing she was looking for, that was clear. Unfortunately, Jolene had no idea what that was. "Don't hit me again," Jolene begged, breaking down instantly, her only defense. "I don't know what you're talking about, I swear." Patty knew to watch for this, not to believe it, but still, she couldn't help it. She knelt down, keeping a firm grip on her weapon, keeping it between her and Jolene. Jolene swallowed, staring up at her, finally managing to see her face. She remembered, after all. "Thousand Oaks," she whispered. Jolene nodded slowly, solemnly. The two girls looked into each other's eyes. And they remembered. 1. The incident at Thousand Oaks. "You're 16 now, Joy," her parents had told her. "Don't you think you should do something more with your summer than just lay around the house?" She didn't, but it hadn't actually been the kind of question they expected an answer to. It was a question not unlike, "Don't you think it would be good to learn a musical instrument," which had been asked of her nearly a decade earlier, after her parents had already signed her up for piano lessons. Or, "Don't you think public schools are getting too dangerous nowadays," after they'd already signed her up at a private school. So Jolene had just mutely nodded her head, trying to hide her annoyance as she waited to hear what her parents had gotten her into this time. There wasn't much in the way of jobs in the little town they lived in, certainly nothing she would be qualified for that she'd want to do. Would she be stuck in front of the fry vats at McDonald's all summer, coming home smelling of grease and despair? Would she be at Kroger's instead, stuffing other people's groceries into bags and carting them out to their cars day in and day out? The answer, it turned out, was both better and worse than any of the possibilities that ran through her mind. Thousand Oaks Summer Camp. It wasn't something she really saw herself doing, spending a summer looking after a bunch of 12-year-old girls, but it got her away from home, and her parents, and that was always a plus. She felt awkward around the little girls for the first few days, not quite sure how to talk to them. 12 seemed so young, and sometimes they acted that way, but other times they seemed almost more mature than her. The morning of the 4th day, she'd been unable to sleep, and, not wanting to disturb the still slumbering girls in her cabin, she'd snuck into the bathroom, the light of which was kept on all the time, with the door kept just a bit cracked, and sat down on one of the toilets, propping her feet up on the stall door, and started to read. She was a bit of a bookworm. She'd been hoping to be more of one that summer, as she'd started a particularly long fantasy series as soon as she'd gotten home from the last day of class, planning on making it all the way through before school started back up again, but she was only on the 4th book. To be honest, they were already getting a bit repetitive. She had made her way through only a few pages when she heard someone else shuffle their way into the bathroom. She didn't think much of it until she saw a pair of small, flip-flop clad feet make their way past the door in front of her once, and then twice, not going into the stall on either side until they had done so. It was a small bathroom, especially to have 3 toilets jammed into it, though even after just 4 days, Jo knew it would have been madness for there to be any less with 8 12-year-olds, plus her and the other counselor, there at the same time, so she didn't have to be paying much attention to hear the lack of noise. After a minute or two, she heard the shuffling footsteps leave the stall, heading off to one corner of the room. Then, after a pause, one of the sinks started up. Curiosity got the better of Jo, and she slowly lowered her feet, leaning a hand forward to keep the door from swinging open too suddenly and surprising whoever was there. She pulled the door open just a crack and peeked through, getting just the tiniest glimpse of a retreating shock of bright red hair that could belong only to Mary before the outer door closed, all but a crack. Jo gave Mary a little time to make her way across the dark cabin to her bed before making her way out of the stall, over to the garbage can in the corner of the room. She was a little disappointed that there seemed to be nothing but paper towels inside. Disappointed, and suspicious. Not enough to go digging through the garbage, but enough to ask Jeannie, the other counselor, if she couldn't take the girls swimming on her own the next day, claiming a queasy stomach. She couldn't help but feel kind of creepy as she walked over to Mary's bed, sliding her suitcase out from under it. It was really none of her business, either way, since if it was true, she was obviously taking care of it on her own. But that wasn't enough to stop her from unzipping the suitcase and carefully sifting through it. And, sure enough, there at the bottom, hidden beneath all of her other clothes, was a stack of goodnights. She stared down at them for what felt like an eternity, just looking at them, their slight padding, the delicate, cute butterflies decorating the front. That should have been that. Her hunch confirmed, she should have put everything back, shoved the suitcase back under the bed, went about her day. Yet she found herself picking one up, feeling it with her fingertips. It was stupid, she knew, but some part of her wanted it for herself. She counted the ones remaining in the suitcase, there was enough for the rest of camp, and one extra, other than the one she was still hanging on to, then put everything away. She stood, picking up the goodnight and starting for her own suitcase, only to notice that she wasn't alone. She let out a gasp, barely able to convert the scream that had been building in her throat into that, trying to hide her precious cargo behind her before realizing it was too late. This isn't what it looks like, she said with a blush. Really? Hope raised an eyebrow, putting her hands on her hips in an almost eerie recreation of Jolene's mother's stance when she smelled something fishy. Because it looks like you're taking a diaper out to Mary. Jolene's heart stopped. There was a part that was glad, sure, that Hope thought this was all about Mary, but the rest of her felt terrible for having inadvertently revealed Mary's secret. Obviously, if she was getting up so early to change back into her regular panties, it wasn't something she wanted advertised. Still, Hope was one of the most mature girls in the cabin, so Jolene tried to reason with her. Hope, you can't tell anybody about this, please. It would be humiliating for her. Hope nodded slowly, as if she were thinking about something, then stopped. Wait. She sure never looked like she was wearing a swim diaper under her swimsuit. And I'm sure you and Jeannie wouldn't let her in the pool without one, if she really needed them. Jo had to hand it to her, it was an impressive piece of detective work, especially to come up with off the top of her head. She had no counter for it, other than to shrug and let her continue. Then what are you doing? I mean, it's not like you'd be stealing it for yourself, she giggled, but just for a moment, until she saw Jo's blush, heard her silence. Do you? What? No. Jolene managed to break out of her embarrassment with the help of a little anger. How dare this kid accuse her of wetting the bed? Then again, that was hardly any worse than the reality. She sat down on the edge of Mary's bed with a sigh, not exactly pleased when Hope sat down on the bed next to her, staring at her curiously. There was something in the girl's eyes, some wisdom well beyond her years. Despite herself, Jolene found words tumbling out of her mouth. I just. Well, there's just times, she set the goodnight down on the bed with a sigh. I'll put it back, she said at last. No, go on, Hope encouraged her, leaning forward. And for some reason, she did. You and the other girls are cool, she started, unsure where that had come from, but letting herself go with it, but taking care of you this summer. It's not really my thing. I'd rather be taken care of. Jolene looked up at Hope, expecting to see the mocking that was missing from her voice in her eyes, but those were as serious as her tone. She nodded. It's stupid, Jolene shook her head. I don't know, acting out, 'cause I didn't want this job in the first place. To her horror, she felt a tear start to slide down her cheek, her resentment welling up, mixing with the relief of actually saying as much of this as she could manage out loud, and the embarrassment of saying it to a little kid. It didn't even make sense. She wanted someone to take care of her, to control her, in a way, but she got mad when her parents did just that. Hope got up from the bed, gave her a hug. I don't think you should put it back, she said. She won't miss it, right? Jolene nodded. She has enough. I'm pretty sure she only wears at night. Then keep it, Hope told her. I just came in to grab my towel, so I should probably get going, Jolene nodded. You can't tell anyone about this, either, she said as Hope headed for the door again. About what? Hope gave her a sly grin, and Joe couldn't help but return it. 3 nights later, Jolene died. That was, at any rate, what Patty was sure had happened. She didn't know about the conversation at the time, of course, until that night, 5 years later, out in the snow in the middle of the forest. Jolene didn't breathe a word of it to any living soul. And yet, there in the cold, she felt it pouring out of her. There wasn't much more that had happened during her time at the camp, she said, not until 3 nights later, when, she claimed, she had gotten into her car and drove off while everyone else awake sat huddled in the cafeteria, abandoning everyone she was meant to be looking after, a scaredy-cat through and through. Patty wasn't convinced. Jolene was a chicken, that much was sure. She remembered watching her from across the cafeteria as some of the girls from her cabin snuck up behind her while she was eating, unable to keep from laughing as she let out a blood-curdling shriek, usually spilling her drink across the table, just from a little boo. And, odd as it was, she couldn't say that her story had been as much of a surprise as it should have been. But there had been no escape from the camp that night, not so easily. Other than the occasional glimpse of her at mealtimes, Patty hadn't gotten to know Jolene much, or, really, at all. They'd both shown up a couple days early for a bit of slapdash orientation and training. It consisted mostly of, don't let your kids wander off into the woods and get eaten by a bear, but Patty had mostly steered clear of her. She'd learned to detect stuck-up princesses at school, and Jolene gave off every indication of being one. Technically, Patty supposed that would make sense with Jolene's story of running away, but that still wasn't enough. It had started with Mina, Patty's co-counselor. It was late, past when the kids were all meant to be asleep, but one of them just couldn't find her way off to Slumberland. Mina volunteered to stay with her, but Patty knew she wanted to go join the rest of the counselors back at the main building, especially Paul, so she'd told her to go ahead. Mina promised Patty she owed her one, then went practically racing out the door. The camp was hardly the most intuitively set up there could be. It curved like a horseshoe, with the main building at the bottom, along with the parking and cabins going up either side, girls on one half with the swimming pool, boys on the other with a little baseball diamond, with a path making its way throughout in a half-oval. Other than the road leading in, it was surrounded by the trees on all sides, including the inside. Officially, they were supposed to follow the path whenever they wanted to go to the main building, but most of the counselors only did that when they had their kids with them. It was usually at least a little quicker to cut through the forest at the center, especially for her and Mina, since their cabin was at the very end of the path. That was just what Patty did, once her charge had drifted off to sleep, and she'd made sure all the others were truly asleep as well, and not just pretending to get her out of the cabin for some kind of crazy 12-year-old party. The moon was full, hanging low over the trees, so she hadn't bothered to bring her flashlight along. She started to regret it as she made her way through the forest, weaving past the trees, dead leaves from the year before crunching slightly beneath her feet. She knew there wasn't really anything to worry about there, but that didn't make her feel any less paranoid. She'd made the trip every night, but every other night, Mina had been there with her. But that was just her acting silly, she told herself. If there really was something out there, even with 2 of them, they surely would have seen some sign of it by then. Surely. And yet, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself of that, her heart just kept beating louder and louder in her chest, her eyes cutting over towards the path, and the lampposts outside the cabins. She took a step or 2 over towards them, then shook her head, resolving to stop acting like an idiot. When she turned around, she nearly ran straight into Mina. She didn't recognize her at first, as she was used to staring at the other girl's face, rather than her pale stomach, almost glowing in the moonlight. Patty took a step back, not sure what was going on for a moment, until she saw Mina's face, hanging a few feet from the ground, a pair of red marks stretching across her neck. Later, she'd remember the relatively small amount of blood pooled below Mina, the jagged quality of the cuts, rips, almost, in her skin, but at the time, she simply found her eyes going wide as she stumbled backwards, tripping over a branch and falling. She scrambled back up to her feet, running out towards the cabins, sure she felt someone there, trailing her, their hot breath right on her neck. The light from the lamps did little to make her feel safe, so once she was free of the tangle of branches and leaves in the forest, her footsteps only grew quicker. She finally dared to glance behind her after she'd passed a cabin or 2, allowing herself to slow slightly when there was no sign of anybody following her. As she reached the pool, she let herself stop completely, leaning against the chain-link fence surrounding it and fighting to catch her breath, eyes scanning the forest, jumping as the light above the pool flickered and died with impeccable timing. What was going on? Was it some kind of a prank? Mina did have a weird sense of humor, but this seemed a little much even for her, not to mention she'd had to have gotten help from someone else equally warped. Maybe it had been one of the boys. She knew that made more sense than Mina actually getting killed and hung from the trees. No, she was just being silly, falling for the prank like a sucker. She shook her head, laughing quietly as she straightened herself up, stepping away from the fence and starting to head down the path to the main building. If her partners in crime weren't lurking about, Mina could just stay in the tree the rest of the night, maybe that would teach her a lesson. Something caught her attention at the corner of her eye, making her turn her head just a touch, just enough for her to see the pool. For a moment, it looked normal, until she noticed a darker patch of water. She turned further, following it, watching the spot get larger and larger, until at last she saw the person there, floating face down, fully dressed, the darker color seeming to emanate from them. The light flickered back to life with a dull hum. "Shit," Patty said under her quickening breaths. "Shit shit shit." And then she heard a sound behind her. She turned, backing away right as a baseball bat clanged against the fence in front of her, wielded by a wiry middle-aged man with thick glasses, whose expression changed from anger to shock as she watched. "I'm so sorry," he exclaimed, lowering the bat quickly. "I thought you were." Patty kept backing away. "Stay the hell away from me," she warned, reaching into her pocket, as if there was something there that would help her, rather than just lint. Her eyes darted back towards the pool. "I don't know who you are, but..." And she never found out. She had her ideas, of course, but there had never really been time for a proper introduction. "He was a psychiatrist," Jolene interrupted. "He was from the asylum. He came to the main building, told us all to be careful, but some of the counselors went out to help the kids." Patty didn't need to hear what had happened to them. She'd seen them, strewn across the lawn like confetti. "He was lying," she told Jolene. "That thing didn't come from any asylum, and neither did he. I didn't kill that poor boy," he said. "I don't have time to explain, nor to escort you to safety. Take this and go to the main building. Barricade yourself in with the others." He handed her the baseball bat, though she shied away from his hand at first, then hurried off into the night. Patty stared down at it for a moment or 2, something in her telling her to trust him, to follow him. He had, after all, given away what seemed to be his only weapon. She knew that was hardly enough to actually justify blindly trusting some random guy, when all this weird stuff, and she still wasn't convinced it wasn't just an elaborate prank was going on, but she did anyway. The man held a finger to his lips as she approached, giving her a hard stare. After a moment, she realized he was telling her to be quiet. Then he pointed back down the path to the main building, a much clearer signal. She shook her head and, a bit reluctantly, handed the bat back to him. He opened his mouth, then shook his head and nodded, gesturing for her to follow him. He moved quietly, slowly, glancing towards the silent cabins for a few seconds before moving on. It was Patty and Mina's cabin where he stopped longer, apparently having heard something more. He made her stay outside, holding her back with one hand before venturing inside. If she'd stayed in the cabin for a few minutes longer, if the kid hadn't been able to get to sleep, if she'd decided it was getting late, she was tired, it wasn't worth it to trek over to the main building, she would have still been inside. That was one of the things that haunted her, ever since. But not the main thing. The man stumbled out, the baseball bat tumbling to the ground, his eyes dazed. He didn't even seem to see her. I have to find the other, he was saying to himself. There's always two. He vanished into the darkness, never to be seen by Patty again, no matter how hard she tried to track him down, to get his help. The other might have reared its head, repeated that night with everything it had learned from its master, but the next morning, after the police had gone, the place was deserted. Patty thought about it sometimes, about the weeds growing up around the cabins, erasing the baseball diamond, about dead leaves filling the pool, soaking up the stagnant water. That haunted her, too, now and then. But it was the inside of her cabin that showed up in her nightmares most often. If she'd been there just a little longer, sure, she might have died, too, but at least she might have done something before she went, might have made some contribution to save those kids. He didn't look like much, the person who had done it. He was older than she had been then, though maybe about the same age as she was now, and small. But she could feel the evil coming from him, saw the work of his hands, saw the blood on his lips, and knew it hadn't come from within, just knew it. As surely as she knew what he was, what he had been. The baseball bat was evidence, she knew that, too, but she barely even remembered taking it with her as she slowly made her way to the parking lot, putting it into her trunk as, deep down the dark, twisting road, she saw flashing lights approach, too late, as always. Someday she would need it. Some dark, snowy day. 2. Ghosts of Christmas Past. You're 21, Joy, her parents had told her. Don't you think it's time you paid for Christmas presents on your own? That was unfair, it wasn't as if Jolene had asked for them to fund all of her present buying, just a bit of a supplement. But she knew their minds weren't going to be changed by such logic as that. 5 years had passed quietly, sneaking past Jolene with barely a warning. She'd finished high school, of course, but after that, there had been no big changes. Everything felt as if it was standing still, as if her life had frozen that day at camp. So it was hardly surprising that, even after all that time, she'd recognized hope in a heartbeat. Jobs hadn't exactly become any more plentiful over the years, it had been the opposite, actually, even with her opportunities opening up as she got older. In all honesty, she hadn't exactly minded. Her friends were all scrambling to find some great career so they could move out, or succeeding in doing so, but she was happy where she was. She felt safe there, stable. She supposed it could be said she was only stable because she was stuck in a rut, but it was a rut she was more than happy with, so she didn't mind. You must be our new elf. Hope greeted Jolene cheerfully as she anxiously entered the door marked Employees Only, walking over to her and shaking her hand boisterously. She must be 16 or 17 now, Jolene calculated, and a lot had happened to her over those 5 years. Much more than had happened to Jolene. She wasn't a kid anymore, not by a long shot. Looking at the two of them side by side, Hope might even have been mistaken as the older, helped by the few inches she had on Jolene. Her costume, a mid-thigh green dress trimmed with fur, tights, and a green Santa hat, looked better on her than it had any right to. Why yeah, Jolene replied nervously, searching Hope's eyes for any sign of recognition. She'd interviewed with someone who worked for the mall, and, with no little siblings or cousins, hadn't had any reason to look at the elves. She never would have applied if she'd known this spectre of her past would be waiting for her, even if the job seemed incredibly easy. I'm Joy. Hope nodded, smiling indecipherably. I'm Hope. Nice to meet you. Let's get you all set up. Jolene nodded, following the younger girl obediently. There probably should have been a part of her that rankled a bit at working under someone 5 years her junior, but apparently that part was missing. The woman she'd interviewed with had mentioned the supervisor was pretty young, though never specified, just said she'd worked there the year before and done a great job. Jolene wondered if it was too late to switch, to work during the day, while Hope would be at school, instead of in the evenings, even if that might mean having to wake up earlier. There's not a lot of costumes left, Hope mused, looking Jolene over. I hope we can find one that'll fit you. She pulled open a box, peering inside and digging through it before pulling out a dress identical to hers, except much smaller. Why don't you try this one? She nodded towards a door, handed the dress over. The door led to a small bathroom, which Jolene quickly locked, hanging the dress up on a hook on the back of the door and staring at herself in the mirror, a hand on either side of the sink as she bent in closer. Was she as recognizable as she thought? Maybe the years had changed her a bit. Or maybe that memory wasn't as ingrained in Hope's mind as deeply as in hers. After all, it hadn't been a confession for her, just a weird little episode with a camp counselor she'd never seen again after just a few days. Or perhaps she'd tried to forget it, to erase all memories of that camp. She might have been young enough to succeed at it, even though Jolene hadn't had any luck. Maybe. Or maybe Hope just didn't care. Even with all the possibilities, Jolene found it difficult to reopen the bathroom door, once she'd stripped out of her sweater and pulled on the dress, and only partly because it was too short for her. It was only a bit longer than her sweater had been, prompting her to leave her jeans on as she stepped back out with a blush. She saw Hope bite her bottom lip, probably trying not to laugh. Okay, maybe that won't work, she said after a moment to regain her composure. But after a minute or two of digging, she looked back up at Jolene, worried. That's the biggest one we have left. She shrugged, unable to hide the little smile that began to creep across her face. I'm sure we'll think of something. Patty was uncertain. While it was true Jolene had been a coward in life, all of Patty's research showed that the life after always seemed to make people stronger, more cocky. It was a big self-esteem boost, with a healthy dose of added evil. Sure, they could act scared, especially in the face of their imminent re-death, but to some little teenager? She couldn't see it. On the other hand, Jolene was clearly dressed like an elf, and that wasn't something she'd seen many other vampires stoop to, either. Was it possible she'd simply stumbled upon the most ineffectual vampire ever? One that she'd be doing a favor, not just to the world, but to it, personally, by killing it? No, not killing, she reminded herself. Slaying was the technical term, the one she'd used to psych herself up for this, to convince herself she could do it. Things may have gone back to normal for Jolene, but Patty knew things would never be the same before she'd even set foot outside the camp. There were dark things in the world, she now knew, things most people were oblivious to. She could attempt to ignore them, for the first week or so, while she was still trying to figure everything out, she did try, but they kept haunting her from the shadows of her dreams, shapeless, but definitely there, and very, very evil. The modus operandi for most monsters was rather similar to what she'd seen, luring caretakers out into the night, killing innocents, but it hadn't taken her long to figure out it had been a vampire. It had a human shape, after all, which narrowed things down a good ways. The moon had been full, so a werewolf was also a possibility, though she didn't buy that. While they did tend to revert to their human form after death in movies, Patty had a feeling that, in real life, they'd still be wolves until the full moon set. And, besides, werewolves, in their more beastly shapes, didn't seem smart enough to hang their victims from tree limbs to terrify future prey. Her parents hadn't understood, not that she could really blame them. They did their best to be understanding, considering what she'd been through, but even so, they just wouldn't, or couldn't, accept the truth. She played along for a while, even went to the psychiatrist for them a couple times, until he started trying to get her to take pills. Her parents agreed with him, of course. So she left. She couldn't afford the dullness the drugs would bring, couldn't let herself chase away the dreams, much as she'd like to be rid of them. They kept her sharp, kept her resolve strong, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, when the time came, she would have a chance to slay at least one of the monsters. She took the bat. She knew it was just a regular baseball bat, nothing special, even a little beat up, but she felt safe with it. She took her car, too, stopping at a Walmart a few towns over to take a license plate off a car at the edge of the parking lot there, ditching her own after a few more hours of driving, flinging it over the fence at the landfill just outside town. She'd read somewhere that vampires would likely return to the place they were reborn, but she didn't dare try to go back to the camp. In her mind, that was the most obvious place to go, which meant there was a chance her parents, or her shrink, would realize she would probably head there. And she couldn't let herself get caught. Instead, she pulled her notebook out of the glove compartment. When she'd gotten home, it had been one of the first things she'd done, while everything was still fresh on her mind. She'd written down everything she remembered about her fellow counselors, where they lived, where they went to school, whatever she could think of that she'd spoke with them about, or overheard from other conversations. She'd seen a lot of them the day after, sure, and even some out in direct sunlight. But who knew how long the transformation could take? And there was some lore, including the original Dracula story, that suggested vampires could, in fact, endure a little light. So, knowing nobody was truly beyond suspicion, she took out her list, read over it once, then again, and then started out on her hunt. "They are too big, can't we just leave it at that?" Jolene called through the door. It seemed rather unlikely, looking back, for half of her costume to only be available in a size too small for her, and the other half too baggy, begging the question of whether they could be called tights if they weren't. "Just come on out, Joy," Hope coaxed her. "Let me see how bad it is, so I can see what we need to do." "We need to get a new costume," Jolene wanted to say, but she didn't want to sound too demanding, or too whiny. It was her first day, after all, and, whether she wanted to be there or not, she didn't want to start off on a bad foot. So, with one hand pulling the hem of her skirt down and her tights up in the front, she made her way out of the bathroom. "Oh, those aren't that bad," Hope said, making her way around a nervous Jolene, who kept turning her head to try to see what the other girl was doing, until she pulled out the back of the tights and let them snap back at Jolene's bottom. Jolene blushed, her eyes going down to the floor. She heard the bathroom door shutting behind her, then Hope giggled. "Sorry, Joy, couldn't resist. You just remind me so much of my little sister with that cute little penguin." Jolene began to open her mouth, to protest that Hope was an only child, before stopping herself. It had been 5 years, maybe that had changed. If it had, of course, that meant she reminded Hope of a 4, or less, year-old, which just made her blush more deeply than she already was, knowing someone was looking at her panties, more cutesy than anything most girls her age, or even half her age, would ever be caught in, with their little penguin in a scarf staring out from the back. Either way, there was no reason she should know anything about Hope's siblings, or lack thereof, if she was sticking with her act of not knowing who Hope was. "How old did you say you were?" Hope asked, coming back around in front of Jolene at last. Well, I'm turning 16 near the end of the month," she lied. "I kinda lied about when my birthday was to get this job. I guess I probably shouldn't have told you that." Hope melted, giving Jolene a quick hug. "Oh, I won't tell on you, sweetie. Now, you just wait here, and I'll get this all sorted out." With that, she was gone, leaving Jolene all alone in the little room, trying to keep her underwear covered. She stood there for a few minutes, dumbly glancing around, before realizing she could just go back in the bathroom and change. Feeling silly, she reached out for the doorknob, turned it. Or tried to. The knob refused to turn, no matter how many times she jiggled it. She started to feel trapped, as if she were inside the bathroom rather than out, her heart fluttering faster until it spiked at a sudden ding. She turned around wildly, feeling slightly better to notice a microwave sitting on the counter on one side of the room. Hope must have been heating something up, she mused. Nothing weird about that. She did her best to calm herself down, reassure herself that Hope didn't know anything. She wasn't acting like she was suspicious, as far as Jolene could tell. Jolene had probably just accidentally relocked the door when she was coming out, and Hope hadn't realized. She sat down at the edge of the beat-up couch, feeling strange not having anything more substantial than the saggy pair of tights between the furniture and her underwear, making herself as comfortable as she could manage. It didn't take long for Hope to reappear, a shopping bag in hand. She paused at the door for a moment, then began to approach. "How old did you say you were, Joy?" 15, she repeated, more confident this time. "That's what I thought you said," Hope nodded. "Which is weird. Because I thought you were more like 5. Jolene squirmed in her seat. "What? Oh, maybe not on the outside," Hope continued, walking toward Jolene. "But on the inside? Definitely." She grabbed something out of the bag, and before Jolene could stop her, had pinned it to the dress. Jolene looked down in confusion, seeing the pacifier now swinging off her costume. "Put it in your mouth." "Hope, what are you?" Hope lifted the pacifier, popped it into Jolene's mouth. "Sure, it's all right," Hope said. "I'm going to take care of you now." Jolene knew she should protest, she should take the pacifier out, should run out of there, should do something. But she couldn't. She wanted to fight back as Hope pushed her back onto the couch, pulled her tights down, but all she could do was lay there. "I don't know if goodnights would still fit you," Hope said, "but even if they did, I bet they wouldn't hold up your tights well enough. These are more fitting, anyway, don't you think?" Hope smiled, taking a package of adult diapers up, then tugging it open. "I think this is what you really want." Hope took a hold of Jolene's panties. Jolene winced at the ripping sound that came from one side, and then the other. "Those are adorable," Hope told her, "but you're not going to need them anymore." Jolene felt something being slid under her, something thick and cushy, that her bottom sank into as her ruined underwear was yanked away. She could only manage a weak wriggle as the diaper was taped securely around her, then followed up with another one, then covered with her tights, which stayed up easily now, with the added bulk. "Good girl," Hope cooed, patting the back of the diapers gently, pulling Jolene to her feet. "That's just about perfect," she nodded, before heading over to the microwave. Jolene's eyes darted to the door, to her escape, but it was the only part of her body that she dared to move. There was something soothing about all of this, much as she didn't want to admit it, something comforting about the feel of the diapers around her, the sensation of sucking on her pacifier, something more comforting than the hundreds of sessions she'd had with her shrink, after that summer, something she'd been too scared to try herself. "Not yet," she heard Hope say, and then the other girl returned, putting her hands on Jolene's shoulders and guiding her back to the couch, sitting her down on it and then moving behind her. Jolene's eyes closed as she felt a brush being run through her hair, almost forgetting where she was, what was happening. She felt her hair being gently manipulated into a pair of pigtails. "I always knew I'd find you again," Hope whispered in her ear. Jolene nodded slowly, in a daze, letting Hope stick a pair of shoes on her feet, a Santa hat on her head. She heard the microwave door open behind her, then stood as Hope tugged at her hand. There was a slight rush of cool air as the back of her diaper was pulled out, only to be replaced with a thick, warm mess that woke her up quickly. "What are you doing?" she demanded, finally letting her pacifier fall from her mouth, although it didn't fall far. "Just adding the finishing touch," Hope said, letting the diapers and tights snap back into place, patting the rear again and spreading the contents. You look perfect now. She set a large measuring cup down on the couch, a bit of thick oatmeal still resting in the bottom, just as the rest of the contents were now resting in the bottom of Jolene's underwear. Don't spit out your parky. The pacifier was shoved back between her teeth, and then she was being led by the hand towards that door, the one to the rest of them all. Jolene began to squirm, to fight against Hope's grip. She'd almost forgotten where she was, what was going on, but she remembered now, and she knew she couldn't let it happen. Stop it, she said, spitting out her pacifier again. Why? Hope asked. You're the little baby elf. You look adorable, sweetie, you're going to be so popular. And nobody will ever know how much you like it. I can't go out there like this, Jolene protested. But this is what you want, Hope smiled. And now, I'm going to give it to you. Aha, Patty nodded, raising an eyebrow. So you just ran off then, huh? Finally snapped out of it and realized how crazy it was? Basically, Jolene shrugged. That's quite a story, Patty said, leaning against her baseball bat. Oh, and yours isn't? Jolene asked. Spending 5 years hunting fictional monsters because you can't accept that a human could do something as horrible as what happened at camp. It was just a person. A lunatic, but just a human. Patty shook her head. Of course, she'd wondered if that wasn't the case. When she'd run out of gas in her car, and money to put more in, she'd wondered. When she'd run away from the third straight house of a former counselor because she overheard their parents calling the police to tell them they had a missing person, she'd wondered. When she'd started having to keep to the shadows as she watched the people from her list, feeling more like a monster herself than the hero she knew she was, she'd wondered. There's always two, she said again. He had to know there was a risk he'd be taken down. He would have turned someone before going in for the big feast. You. She lifted the bat, pointing it at Jolene. I haven't killed anyone, Jolene countered. Can you say the same? Shut up, Patty growled. Reminded herself it wasn't killing, not when they weren't human. But was she wrong? Jolene's story was pretty unbelievable, but, if you thought about it, wasn't hers as well? Wouldn't someone have gone public with the fact that vampires were real? In the age of YouTube and Twitter, nothing could stay secret forever. He wasn't a vampire, Jolene went on quietly. Just a garden variety psycho. But he did turn someone. Shut up! Patty yelled, kicking Jolene in the chest, knocking her onto her back in the leaves and snow, poising the sharpened tip of her bat over the other girl's chest. But she couldn't push it down. What was more unlikely, she wondered? Was it someone making up some fanciful quest to deal with what she'd seen? Was it another person drifting blandly through life before allowing herself to find comfort in the loss of control? She shook her head, raised the bat higher, staring down into Jolene's eyes, raising it a little too high, enough that it could allow Jolene to roll away, to escape and strike back. Patty's hands began to sweat, just slightly. Do you really have what it takes? Jolene asked, with the hint of a smile playing across her lips. Patty's fists tightened around the bat, raised it again, muscles tensing. Blood splashed against the white snow, and out in the forest, one girl died. A tongue darted across a pair of lips instinctively, licking a stray fleck of blood from them before they began to form a slow, small smile. The end.